Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great break. Now we're going to do our third presentation of the morning. And today's presentation is going to be on Pell Grants, Parents, and Pathways. And credit to Maria for the clever title of this presentation. I really love it. And so what our focus is going to be is on expanded Pell Grant eligibility and transparency. We'll also talk about parent and family information changes that have occurred. Maria touched on those. We'll go a little bit deeper into them. And then we're going to talk about pathways for students who have unusual circumstances or who are homeless youth. So let's start with expanded Pell Grant eligibility and transparency. One of the best things I think to come out of FAFSA simplification is the fact that Pell Grant eligibility has been expanded. You may be familiar with, in the past, a student was eligible for a Pell Grant if they had an EFC or an expected family contribution that was in that eligible range. The challenge was they didn't know if they had an eligible EFC until they filed the FAFSA. But now there are going to be multiple ways that Pell Grant eligibility is going to be calculated. We are going to be able to determine whether or not a student is going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, and we can do that even before a FAFSA is filed. There will also be the opportunity for a student to qualify for a Pell Grant based on a calculated SAI, and there'll be the opportunity for a student to receive a minimum Pell Grant, again, based on poverty tables and some items that we're going to explore a bit further. So the good news is that there are multiple ways for the student to qualify for a Pell Grant, and they will receive the maximum amount they are eligible for within any of those categories. So for today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on criteria for dependent students. Very similar criteria exists for independent students as well, but in the essence of time, we just don't have enough of it today. And I think that the examples given with dependent students will be enough to help people understand that it works very similarly with independent students. Additionally, we'll share these resources when we send out the follow-up email so that you can see what the tables are for independent students as well. So let's start with who qualifies for a maximum Pell Grant when we're talking about dependent students. So if you are working with students today, you can get a sense of whether or not a student might be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. For example, if that student's parents are not required to file a federal tax return, not saying that they don't, but they're not required to, then that student is automatically eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. Additionally, if you have a student that you're working with who has a single parent and the parent's AGI is between 0 and 225% of the poverty guidelines for that family size, then they will be eligible for the maximum Pell Grant. If you have a parent who is not a single parent and has an AGI that is between 0 and 175% of the poverty tables, they are going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. So you're going to notice a theme here, that these poverty guidelines are going to be criteria that we can use to determine eligibility for a Pell Grant, and we will be able to do that even if the student hasn't filed a FAFSA yet, or might be a year or two out from even applying for financial aid. The last piece of criteria that I want to mention is if we have students who have parents, and these students have to be under the age of 33, who have died serving in the armed forces after 9/11 or in the line of duty as a public safety officer, they will also be eligible for the maximum Pell Grant. You might be familiar with, in the past, there was something called the Iraq and Afghanistan Service Grant, and there was also something called the Children of Fallen Heroes Award. And these programs have now been merged underneath the Pell Grant program. So they're not being funded separately. So these students, if they meet that criteria, will be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, but their other aid, all of the other aid that they might be eligible to receive, will be determined based on their calculated SAI, or New Student Aid Index. So they're a little bit different than those first three categories. Those first three categories we'll have an SAI that will be used for not only the maximum Pell Grant, but will be used for all of the other types of aid that they are eligible to receive. Okay, so how fabulous is it that ahead of time, we're going to be able to talk with students and families, and if they have a sense of their income and we have the poverty guidelines in front of us, we can really predict whether or not they're going to be able to get a maximum Pell Grant if they file the FAFSA. Good incentive there, hopefully. So then there's also the ability to qualify for a Pell Grant based on the SAI. We're calling this the calculated Pell Grant. So students who are not automatically eligible for the maximum Pell Grant may be eligible for this calculated Pell Grant. Now, what a calculated Pell Grant is it's the maximum Pell Grant minus the student aid index. So, for example, the maximum Pell Grant for the upcoming year is $7,395. So, I mean, that's a significant amount of money. So when you calculate the calculated Pell Grant, what you do is you take the maximum Pell for that year and you subtract the student's SAI. So let's say in this case, the maximum Pell Grant is the $7,395. The SAI is $1,005. The calculated Pell is going to be $6,390. And this is so much simpler than it used to be. I'm a former financial aid person, and I know many of the team are. And in the financial aid world, what we've had for all of the years is this chart, and this awful chart that we would tape to our monitors. And so what we would have to do is go look on that chart to see what the student's EFC was. And then based on the student's EFC, we would figure out what their Pell Grant eligibility was going to be. So I love that they have made this simpler so that if we know someone's SAI and we know that they're going to be full-time, then we can tell them what their calculated Pell Grant eligibility is going to be, because it's so simple now. Maximum Pell minus SAI is going to give us what the student's calculated Pell amount is going to be. And then last but not least, the third way to qualify for a Pell Grant is to determine whether or not a student is eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. And so again, this is going to be based on those poverty guidelines. So if we have a student whose parent is a single parent, and they have an AGI of less than 325% of the poverty guidelines for their family size, they are going to be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. If we have a student whose parent is not a single parent and has an AGI of well, that should be less than, sorry about that. That should be less than, I'll fix that in the slide. Then they are eligible for a minimum Pell Grant, okay? So that's how students can qualify for the minimum Pell Grant. Now, what's the amount of the minimum Pell Grant? It's going to be 10% of the maximum Pell Grant. So just to make the math easy, let's assume that for now, the maximum Pell Grant is $7,500. The minimum Pell Grant would be $750. So often every year, the maximum Pell is going to change. And so when the maximum Pell changes, the minimum Pell is going to change as well. So one of the things that's important is sometimes qualifying even for a minimum Pell Grant is what is going to open up financial aid opportunities. We have some programs beyond financial aid, to be honest with you, that if a student is a recipient of a Pell Grant, that opens up other programs to them. So being able to qualify for a minimum Pell, not that $750 or whatever the amount is, isn't wonderful, but it's even more than that. It sometimes opens up other important programs to that student. And again, I said it a moment ago, but the student will be eligible for the highest amount. So let's just say they don't qualify for a maximum Pell. They qualify for a scheduled Pell of $1,000. And then they also meet the criteria to be considered for a minimum Pell. And let's say that's $750. They will get the $1,000 Pell Grant. They'll get that higher scheduled Pell Grant amount. So I thought it might be helpful to actually see the real incomes that are behind this so that we can get a sense of what our students might be eligible to receive. And I think this early awareness piece is just so significant. We know sometimes that there are students and families who don't apply for financial aid because they don't think they're going to be eligible, or they don't realize how much they potentially could be eligible to receive. So what the federal government has done is say, hey, let's be able to tell people earlier if they're eligible for a maximum or a minimum Pell. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use the poverty tables, the poverty guidelines, to be able to predict that. And so what they've done is they've created these Pell lookup tables. They don't look that much different than the poverty tables do, or the poverty guidelines, but they have reworked them just a little bit. So what you can see here is, just say, for example, that this dependent student's parent is single. So let's say we have a student lives with mom is a single parent, and mom has 2 kids. So they have a family size of 3. So based on the table, and you'll notice that it's for 2022, it's always going to be the same year of the income that's required on the FAFSA. So this family of 3 can have an income, this mom can have an income of up to $51,818, and the student will be eligible here for a maximum Pell Grant. You'll see this column here is maximum Pell Grant eligibility. Okay. You look over here, mom can earn up to $74,000, or have an income of $74,848, and the student is going to be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. So this is where we can really see the expansion of the Pell Grant program. Many more students and families are going to be eligible to receive a Pell Grant. And you can see that it goes up as family size increases to really pretty substantial amounts. And again, there are tables like this for our independent students as well. So this is for a parent when the parent is a single parent. Then there's this table here if the student's parent is not a single parent. So again, dependent student, let's say in this case, parents are married. There are 2 kids in the household, so it's a family size of 4. The student is going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant if the family's income is less than $48,563. They're going to be eligible for the minimum Pell Grant if their family's income is less than $76,313. So to not only be able to tell this ahead of time, but to see the expansion of the program is really great. So what the feds did create are these Pell lookup tables, and we will share those when we send out the email as a follow-up to this training today. Another thing I wanted to share with you is this chart that was put together by NASFA. So basically, this is how you can determine whether or not a student is eligible for a Pell Grant, and if so, what type of Pell Grant. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, although I do have this printed out and available at my desk. But let's just say, for example, if we start here at the top, the first question is, did the dependent student's parents or an independent student, because it works the same way, file taxes for the applicable year? If no, that family was not required, either the dependent parents or the independent student was not required to file taxes, then we come down here and what we can see is that they're going to be eligible for the maximum Pell. So they are going to qualify for that maximum Pell, and additionally, they are going to have an SAI of a negative 1,500. That's another thing that is new this year. You're going to notice that if they qualify based on the poverty tables, they're going to have an SAI of 0. So what they have tried to do, my understanding is at the federal level, is to help schools have a better sense of how needy their most needy students are. So many schools have a lot of students who have a 0 EFC. Well, if you have half of your population that's eligible or has a 0 EFC or SAI going forward, how do you distinguish among them if you have some additional funding that might be available? And one way they think they can do this is if there is this minimum SAI. That minimum SAI will help them kind of distinguish, if they have resources, who they might want to give them to. So I just wanted to share that. That's a new thing. It doesn't mean they can have more than the cost of attendance, though. It still is a requirement that students, when they are receiving financial aid, that their total aid cannot exceed the cost of attending that particular school. So I thought this is a good chart that might be helpful, even though it is pretty complex. So now let's do a poll. So just give me a moment here. I'm going to pull up this poll. Got a couple of them here. Okay, we've launched the poll. So here is the first poll question. What information is needed to determine if a dependent student is eligible for a maximum or a minimum Pell Grant before the FAFSA is filed? So what is required? Do we need to know the parent's marital status? Do we need to know the number of members, family members? Do we need to know the number of students in college? And do we need to know the appropriate tax filing year? One of those things we don't need to know. So go ahead. I'm going to give you a minute more. Like we've got a lot of results counting here, and you're doing great so far. All right. So let me share the poll now. So what you're going to see, and you did a fabulous job, and almost everyone got this right, that what we don't need to know is the number of students in college. The number of students in college will no longer impact the SAI, and therefore no longer impact federal Pell Grant eligibility either. So that piece of information we don't need to know. What we do need to know is the parent's marital status, the number of family members, in which tax year we're looking at. All right, so now let's move on and talk about parent and family information changes. As I mentioned earlier, Maria did touch on some of this, but we think repetition is going to be really helpful because we have so many changes. Sometimes we found personally that we need to hear things several times over and over again in some cases. So there is a new definition of the parent on the FAFSA, starting with the 24-25 year. The parent who provides the greater financial support is the parent responsible for completing the FAFSA. So if we've got a situation where parents are divorced or separated, then what the student needs to do is to figure out which parent provided the greater financial support, and that's going to be the parent who completes the FAFSA. It used to be the parent that the student lived with most. So that has changed, is going to change with the 24-25 FAFSA. Now, if that parent is married, so let's just say the parent who provided the most financial support was mom, and in that case, mom was remarried, and mom is remarried as of the day that the FAFSA is filed. That's the key date, is as of the day the FAFSA is filed. Then mom's spouse's information would also be required on the FAFSA. Now, whether or not the spouse needs to have their own FSA ID to provide consent, that depends on whether they filed a married joint tax return or separate tax returns. So just like with all other parents, if the parents are married and they filed a joint tax return, then only one parent has to provide consent. However, if the parents are married and filed separate tax returns, then both parents are going to need their own FSA ID because they are both going to have to sign in and provide consent. So this part about the parent being married to the step parent and having to provide step parent information, this is not new, but it is something that comes up a lot. So we wanted to be sure to call it out and address it today. All right, so we have talked about the fact that household size has been renamed, and we are now talking about family size. So dependents who qualify are qualifying children and qualifying relatives as defined by the IRS are now the individuals who are making up family size. So it used to be a different definition for household size. Family size is now going to come into alignment with the definitions used by the IRS. Family size will be transferred from the tax return. So it's going to be calculated based on the number of dependents and whether it's a single or joint tax return. So that family size will be calculated, and it's going to be sent into that FTI module that lives just beside the FAFSA. But this will not be visible within the FAFSA. So family size will not be something that the family will see. So what they're going to have to do, ideally, is have their tax return with them so that they can take a look at their tax return and see whether the family size that is on their tax return, when they add them all together, is accurate. And if it's accurate, great, they don't need to do anything. If they notice that it's inaccurate, maybe it's because they're switching off years of who's claiming children. So that's really an issue with maybe parents who have been divorced. or maybe they'd have a new family member that's now in the family that wasn't, but it meets the IRS criteria or definition, then they can go in and they can update that family size. But the challenge is that they're not going to see that family size, so they won't know if it needs to be updated unless they take a look at their tax return. Now, sometimes it's very stable. You know, my family size has basically been the same for years and years and years. So even without looking at my tax return, I know what it would be. But for families who have, you know, more complicated situations, it's really going to be important for them to have that tax return beside them when they're filing their FAFSA. And then another piece that I wanted to mention is this change regarding families who have multiple children in college. The parent SAI is no longer going to be divided by the number of children in college at the same time. So in the past, what would happen with the EFC is that if you had an EFC, a parent EFC of 12,000, and there were 2 children in college at the same time, then the EFC would be divided in half, and one student would have a parent EFC of 6,000 and the other student would have a parent EFC of 6,000. And that's no longer going to happen. They're both going to have an SAI of 12,000 in that scenario. And we know people are not at all happy about that. Now I'm going to explain why it was removed in just a moment. But one thing I did want to clarify is that the question will remain on the FAFSA. So when you're going through the FAFSA and you're thinking, well, Milo said that wasn't going to be on there. Actually, the question does remain. It just will not be used to calculate, to factor into the calculation of the SAI. The question will remain so that schools can use that information when awarding institutional aid if they desire. So it might be a case where a school can see, you know, that the family has multiple kids in college. It's not going to impact Pell Grant eligibility, but they could say, hey, we can see they've got 2 in college. Maybe we want to prioritize them and give them some additional institutional aid or something like that. So the question will indeed be there, but again, will not be used to impact the SAI. So why was the number in college removed? Well, the reason that it was removed is because there has been this desire to make sure that early awareness in terms of Pell Grant eligibility was something we could talk about. We could talk about whether or not a student might be eligible for a Pell Grant long before they filed the FAFSA. So the decision was made to use the poverty guidelines as the criteria, one of the criteria to determine eligibility for these programs. Well, as we just looked at, the poverty guidelines do not take into account the number in college. So therefore, in order to use the poverty guidelines and have them be accurate, they had to remove the number in college from the SAI calculation and from the determination of Pell Grant eligibility. So that's why it was removed. And I think there's, you know, widespread acknowledgement that this is going to be a challenge for some families. We definitely recognize that. Now, theoretically, they were going to offset that by doing what they call making an increase in the income protection allowance. So behind the scenes, I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but behind the scenes, there is an allowance that protects a portion of a family's income. And so they increased that. So more of a family's income is now being protected. So that's great. And that was meant to offset this a bit. The only challenge is that they took away one of the other allowances. So there had been an allowance for state and local taxes. For Maine residents, for most Maine residents, that was 5% of their income. So 5% of their income was protected, and that's gone away. So yes, they tried to correct for this, but in making some other changes, I think it's not, I think we're gonna have families who had multiple kids in college and still do feel the impact of this. All right, it's time for another poll. So let me get it up. I'm going to go ahead here. Okay, this one is a very simple, straightforward one. Question is, the family size is based on the federal tax return and cannot be updated. Is that true or false? And I'll give people a minute to answer that. Great. You're all right on top of things today. All right, let me go ahead, since so many of you already responded, and share the poll. The answer is false. So family size is based on the federal tax return. That part is true. But the false part is that it can be updated. So yes, it can be updated, but again, with the caveat that they're not going to see what they're updating. So one of the things we want families to do is to have that tax return handy so that they have a sense of what the family size was, so they can determine whether or not they do need to update it. I get nervous about families updating things they don't need to. We don't know too much about verification yet, but there's this piece of me that thinks, oh, is that going to impact verification selection if people are updating information? So if they can have their tax return and know for sure, and only update if needed, that I think is the ideal, at least in my mind. All right, now let's move into another segment of this presentation. What I'd like to talk about now are pathways for students with unusual circumstances or students who are homeless youth. So in Nikki's section, she talked about professional judgment. So professional judgment is where financial aid officers or administrators are allowed to go in and to make adjustments to a student's FAFSA based on different circumstances and using their own judgment. So this guidance came out on November 4th of 2022, and it talked about professional judgment. I'm going to say that over the years, I have always kind of used special circumstances and professional judgment interchangeably. And what they have done is they've just kind of redefined these terms to make it a bit more clear. So what special circumstances, refers to is those changes in the financial situation that justify an aid administrator adjusting a data element. So, for example, one of the things that we've heard recently is that when there are multiple kids in college, it is possible for a financial aid office to go in and do a special circumstance adjustment. So they can't go in and adjust the SAI and just say cut it in half. But what they could do is they could recognize with documentation that the family's paying a certain amount out of pocket. And maybe what they do is they reduce the family's adjusted gross income to reflect the fact that some of that income is not available because it's going to pay the other student's tuition. So that's an example of a special circumstance. Adjusting income due to recent unemployment, high medical bills, divorce or separation. Those are all examples of special circumstances. And again, this has been in place for a long time. But now what they've done is they've created this, I don't know if I really want to call it a new category, but they're referring to them as unusual circumstances. This is what I always would have referred to as a dependency override. Okay, so we just a little bit of a change in the terminology. So going forward, when you hear the term unusual circumstances, what that is referring to is students who have circumstances that justify a financial aid administrator making a dependency override. So basically taking a student who is otherwise looks to be dependent and saying, you know what, we're going to override that and we're going to treat you as an independent student who does not have to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So when might that happen? That might happen when there's parental abandonment. The student doesn't even know where their parents are. In cases of abuse, whether that abuse be physical or mental, psychological abuse, it's not safe or healthy for a student to be in contact with their parent. Maybe the parent is incarcerated and the student doesn't have contact with the parent. Those are just some examples of unusual circumstances. And again, that unusual circumstance would result in a potential dependency override if approved by the financial aid administrator. So what we've seen over the last, I'd say, decade is a lot more flexibility from federal student aid in the guidance that they're providing to financial aid administrators in dealing with students who have challenging circumstances. So this has started and it's continuing. And I think as a former financial aid person, you know, some of these things take time to adjust to. In the financial aid office, you get audited every year. You need to be able to show why you made changes. So for financial aid offices, these are some significant changes I'm going to talk about. Again, it's been gradual, but there's a continuation to provide more flexibility, which is great. But at the same time, these are definitely some changes that are occurring, are continuing to occur. All right. So what has happened is that the definition of acceptable documentation for students who have those unusual circumstances and a financial aid administrator is considering a dependency override, those have expanded. Now, this is applicable with the current 23-24 award year. So the guidance came out in November. It's applicable to the 23-24 year and going forward, so to this current year. So what they've done, this is not an exhaustive list of all of the types of documentation that may be used. Okay, so may is important. I'm going to explain why may matters in a little bit. But these are examples of different types of documentation that could be accepted by a financial aid administrator when considering a dependency override for a student. Now what they're saying is that a documented interview between the student and a financial aid administrator is an acceptable form of documentation. So years ago, that was not the case. So this is something new, that a student can have that conversation, can have that interview with a financial aid administrator. The administrator can take notes, and based on that, they can use that as a type of documentation. Additionally, a documented phone call or written statement from a representative of a TRIO program that confirms the student's situation in the TRIO's personal relationship with the student, that is considered an acceptable form of documentation. Additionally, if a financial aid administrator at a past school already made a determination that the student was had unusual circumstances and they wanted to do a dependency override, the new school can use that, or documented phone call or written statement from a state, country, county, or tribal welfare office. So these are all acceptable forms of documentation. This is not all of the acceptable types, but these are considered acceptable. And again, this is expanded. This is a broader list with more flexibility than used to be the case in the past. Additionally, to help make this pathway a little bit easier for students who have these unusual circumstances, is that these adjustments will carry forward to the subsequent year unless the school learns that the student informs the school that their circumstances have changed. So whatever was going on has been resolved and everything's good and they're back with their parents or having contact with their parents, or if the school finds out that there's conflicting information about the student's independence. But barring those things, once you do this dependency override and the financial aid office documents it, that's going to carry forward from one year to the next. So that's different, because what's been the case previously is that every year the financial aid office had to document that again. Every year they had to redocument that student's situation. So now it can carry forward unless these other things occur. Schools are also being required to make determinations in a very timely manner. 60 days is pretty much what they're saying. And the other thing is they're required to let students know that this process exists and to help them walk through this process. Now, what's interesting is I think schools in Maine have always been really great about all this and helping students navigate these processes. But what I'm learning through all of this is that some schools didn't. You know, there have been schools out there that basically said, we're not going to do any professional judgment, just none, and they wouldn't do any. So you might say, well, why are they having to put all of these things in there? I just think it's because some schools were not already doing them, so they're mandating that schools do that. If you are looking for more information on these unusual circumstances, expanded documentation allowances, where you could find that and more information is in what's called a Dear Colleague letter. This is where Federal Student Aid provides clarification of and guidance for different policies. So you will see that that is where you can find the Dear Colleague letter that addresses this situation. There is also a new pathway, a new process for students who are these students that are in difficult situations, have these unusual circumstances, and cannot provide parent information on the FAFSA. And it's not that they've not been able to file a FAFSA in the past. They have been, but when they filed a FAFSA, it was considered invalid and all of that. What's going to happen going forward is that students will be allowed to complete the FAFSA. They're going to be able to indicate that they have unusual circumstances and they can't provide parent information. And they'll be able to submit their FAFSA, and they'll have an SAI calculated. So this, I think, is a really big deal. This means they are going to know that they've got a valid FAFSA, look, everything went through fine, and they're going to have some indication of what their Pell Grant would be if they finish off the rest of this process. Now, as has always been the case, they do still have to work with the financial aid office. So the financial aid office is still going to have to make that final determination based on that documentation that's been submitted. Again, that documentation that we just talked about that's been expanded. So that step is still necessary. But again, financial aid offices are being asked to reach out to students and to contact them and help them navigate this process, which again, I think schools in Maine by and large were doing anyway. So that's not done when the student files a FAFSA. There is still those additional steps in that follow-up. But once that documentation is provided, if a dependency override is granted based on those unusual circumstances, that is going to carry forward in subsequent years as long as the student stays at the same school and as long as nothing changes or there's any conflicting information. So here's a sneak peek. I know you can't really see it. It's not super clear of what the screen will look like when a student has unusual circumstances. So basically they will be able to say, hey, I think I fall into this category. Go ahead and submit their FAFSA. The last thing I wanted to talk about before we break for lunch is I wanted to talk about students who are unaccompanied homeless youth. This is an area where there is the maximum amount of flexibility. Even though we have seen some expansion and flexibility with the unusual circumstances, you're going to see it even further here. So let's start first of all by talking about what an unaccompanied homeless youth is, or who an unaccompanied homeless youth is. So the definition is an unaccompanied homeless youth on the FAFSA is an individual who is a youth that is unaccompanied and homeless, or unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of being homeless. So a key thing that I want to point out here in this definition is this first bullet where it says unaccompanied and homeless youth. So for example, if you had a student who was a homeless student that was living in a homeless shelter with their parents, they would not meet the definition for FAFSA purposes of an unaccompanied homeless youth, because they aren't unaccompanied, they're with their parents. So in those circumstances, the student would still need their parent to provide their information on the FAFSA. Now, likely, if they're living in a shelter, probably struggling financially, they're probably going to be eligible for maximum financial aid, but they would still be required to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So the key is unaccompanied and homeless. Again, or unaccompanied and self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So imagine a student, for example, who is, they went to college and they are living with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and their name is not on the lease, and they break up. And so the student has nowhere to go. They've fractured the relationship with their parents has been fractured. It doesn't exist. In this case, they were homeless, but now they are at risk of being homeless, and they still would qualify and meet this definition. All right, so when it comes to assisting unaccompanied homeless youth, financial aid administrators are required to consider the documentation from the following eligible authorities sufficient. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that language because this is very different than the circumstances that we just talked about. The financial aid administrators are required to consider this documentation sufficient. Basically, they have to. Okay, so if they get documentation from a local educational agency's homeless liaison that the student is homeless, that's considered sufficient documentation. If they're the director or designee of an emergency or transitional shelter or homeless youth center and a couple of other things there, if they get documentation that the student is homeless, or that organization can document the student is homeless, that is considered sufficient. If the director or designee of a TRIO or Gear Up grant program can document, says they are able to document that the student is homeless, that is sufficient. And again, if the financial aid administrator at another institution documented that already, then that is sufficient. This is, remember a moment ago, I talked about the financial aid office may. This is a must. Okay, so if they say, if the student has received documentation determinations from any of these authorities, the school must not request additional documentation, proof, or statements unless they have conflicting information. So this is a very different world for financial aid people. Having to, just say, this is it, that's it. You're not going to ask for anything more. Some schools have over the years asked for a lot of documentation on a lot of things, some schools less, but now they're basically being told, do not ask for any additional information if the student indicates that one of these organizations or individuals is able to document their situation. So what that's going to look like on the FAFSA is they are going to be asked if any of these organizations or people can document that they were homeless or at risk of being homeless. If they can check off one of these boxes, then they will be considered independent. And to take it one step further, the financial aid office doesn't even need to collect this documentation. So basically, the student indicating that one of these organizations is able to is considered sufficient. Now, some schools may still ask for documentation. The financial and the federal student aid wishes that they wouldn't, but some still will, but they don't have to. Now, people might say, well, could anyone just check off the box? Well, sure, anyone can do anything. But keep in mind that when students are signing their FAFSA application with their FSA ID, they are indicating that they are telling the truth and all of that, and they are subject to, fines and perjury and all of that. So we're walking that balance, right? So they are indicating that they are telling the truth, and therefore, based on this alone, they are to be considered homeless, and they do not have to provide additional documentation. So if a student, though, isn't able to say, hey, none of these organizations know I'm homeless. I'm out of high school. I've been out of high school for 3 years. I'm not living in a shelter. I didn't work with a TRIO program. There's basically no one that knows about my situation. Then what happens there is the student can fill out their FAFSA, indicate that they can't provide parent information, and they'll go that provisional independent status student pathway that we talked about earlier. But then what happens is they can sit down with the financial aid administrator, basically, by a Zoom or whatever method the school has in place, and they can have a conversation. And based on that conversation, either a written statement from the student or a documented interview, the financial aid administrator can say, yep, we do. They are homeless, or they're at risk of being homeless. And that's sufficient. That is considered to be sufficient documentation. In financial aid offices, the guidance from federal student aid is you have to make these decisions without regard to the reason. So what they don't want anyone asking the student is, why are you homeless? Like, what did you do? Or what were your circumstances that led to this? That is not what financial aid offices are supposed to do. Instead, what they're supposed to do is just to say, yes, they indeed are homeless based on, the conversation we've had from them, the written statement. Certainly, if others can provide information that indicates that, that can be helpful. But at the end of the day, this decision can be made between the student and the financial aid administrator. And that's, again, assuming that none of those other organizations can document that. So as with unusual circumstances, these determinations are going to carry forward to the next year unless the school has conflicting information or unless the student comes forward and says that their circumstances have changed. So very similar in that regard. So I don't expect everyone to take my word for this, because I know this is a really significant change for financial aid people in particular. So there was another Dear Colleague letter that came out. This one came out on April 14th of 2023. So it's still very recent, that covers what I've talked about, that covers, that this type of documentation is considered to be sufficient, and indicates that collecting it, and especially collecting it, that they don't have to collect it, and they are not supposed to collect anything further when that organization can provide, the student indicates that that organization can provide that documentation. Still working on getting the words all right myself. Okay, so we're on between you and lunch. So let's go ahead and let's do our last poll. All right. get it up here. So here's the last poll. Which of the following are not authorized to document homelessness? Okay. Homeless liaison, director of an emergency shelter, a current employer, a director or their designee of a TRIO program, an FAA from a prior institution. Okay, I'm watching you all make your choices. You guys are so good. This has been great. I am so thrilled about, it just, we're providing so much information, and it looks like you guys are just absorbing it. It's great. Okay, I think we are done. So let me go ahead and show the poll. So who is not authorized? Who is not authorized is the current employer. So they are not one of those organizations where the student can just check off and be considered homeless based on that organization saying that's the case. Okay, so current employer is the answer to that question. Now, that being said, remember the situation where I said none of those organizations can document that. In that case, the student goes down the provisional independence pathway. They meet with a financial aid officer and they discuss their situation. If an employer can speak to their situation, that's a good thing. They certainly could provide that documentation, and that may help the financial aid administrator make that decision. The difference is just that they don't have to accept that and make a decision based on that. All right. That is it for this particular session. So thank you so much for hanging in there. We're going to take a break. We're going to have some lunch, and then we will pick up this afternoon. So again, thank you. And please let us know if you have any questions going forward. Take care. Have a great day.